First, we have the Honorable Tom McMillen, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Lead One Association, which represents athletic directors and programs of the football bowl subdivision. Under his direction, the Lead One Association is influencing the rules of college sports, how they are enacted and implemented, and advocating for future college athletics. At the University of Maryland, Mr. McMillen was a All-American basketball player, and you can see if he stands up. He was also a member of the 1972 Olympic basketball team, and he was valedictorian of his class at the University of Maryland with Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry. Nice. He was selected as a Rhodes Scholar, attended Oxford University, where he received a Bachelor's and Master's of Arts in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. He played 11 years with the NBA. And he also served 3 consecutive terms from the 4th District of Maryland in the United States House of Representatives. And during that time, he co-sponsored the Student Right to Know Act, which required colleges and universities to disclose the graduation rates of its students and student athletes. Secondly, we have Dr. Donna Lopiano, who's the president and founder of the Sports Management Resources, which is a consulting firm that focuses on bringing the knowledge of experienced and expert former athletic directors to assist scholastic and college athletic departments in solving growth and development challenges. She is also an adjunct professor of sports management at Southern Connecticut State University. She was a former chief executive officer of Women's Sports Foundation and was named one of the 100 most influential people in sports. She also served 18 years as the University of Texas at Austin Director of Women's Athletics. She has testified about Title IX and gender equity before 3 congressional committees in the past. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Southern California, and she was also a athlete in 4 different sports. We also have Gabe Feldman. Gabe Feldman is the Sher Gardner Professor of Sports Law, the Paul Abram B. Barron Professor of Law, and the Director of Tulane Sports Law Program. He is also the co-founder and co-director of the Tulane Center for Sport and Tulane University's Associate Provost for NCAA Compliance. He was an associate for Williams and Connolly in Washington, D.C. And before that, he served as a judicial clerk to Judge Susan H. Black of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Jacksonville, Florida. He serves as a consultant for the Knight Commission and as a reporter for the Uniform Law Commission NIL Committee. In January 2021, he testified before the Florida State House of Representatives regarding NIL issues, and previously testified before the United States Congress regarding the interplay between state workplace drug testing laws and collective bargaining drug testing policies of sports leagues. He has served on the NCAA Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports Committee, and he currently teaches antitrust sports law, negotiation and mediation and contracts. And we also have Peter Schoenthal, who earned his bachelor's degree from Florida State University in political science and government and education. And he earned his law degree from the University of Miami Law School. He is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Athliance, which is a Florida-based company founded with the objective to largely mitigate the expected strain that NIL opportunity management is going to place on university athletic departments nationwide. Athliance provides a comprehensive solution that will not only assist with educating student athletes about the new processes and pitfalls, but also simplify and automate the input, approval, monitoring, and reporting process to all NIL opportunities. Thank you all for being here. Yeah. So first, we'd like to have you each do an opening statement of your thoughts on NIL. So we could start with Honorable Tom McMillen.
Well, Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I'm just going to be brief and say, first of all, our ADs are very supportive of name, image, and likeness rights for student athletes. They're not really pleased with the way it's been rolled out in terms of the fact that you have different states and a lack of harmonization across the board. But here's sort of a congressional update. I saw Cory Booker this week at an event. We had a nice chat, but I used to serve in the Energy and Commerce Committee on the Commerce Innovation Subcommittee. And the chair of that committee is Congressman Bill Rackus. Now, I served on that committee. His father was on that committee, believe it or not. And I'm pretty confident that they're going to get a bill out of that committee. They're beginning to write it. And it will be to set up a national standard for NIL. And with the Republicans in control of that committee, I think it'll get through that committee without a lot of other referrals. In the House, that means you're not going to have a lot of issues added to that bill that would go to other committees, like a Ways and Means for taxes or Ed and Labor for Title IX. It'll be a very narrow bill. And the full committee will pass it as well. And I think that'll get done this year. But they will send it to the Senate. Now, in the Senate, much more complicated because this bill will go to the Commerce Committee. And yet one senator in the Senate can really hold up legislation. So you almost have to get 60 votes in the Senate for anything. And that will be the challenge. But I do believe, I believe that the House will get something done. And then the question is, what would be the trade-offs in the Senate? Will they have to add, and usually those trade-offs result in getting votes. So some members have bills in about taking tax deductibility away from collectives. They may have to add that provision. Some have bills in about Title IX, increasing, Title IX penalties and greater Title IX provisions. You may have to add that in the Senate. At the end of the day, that's sort of what they call the Christmas tree effect of legislating. You'll add a number of bills. You may have language on enforcement. Senator from Tennessee has a bill on that. So you have, that's sort of how the sausage making gets done in the Congress. And I do think that there's a good chance that a bill will get done. The question is, will it get done this year? And I think that's obviously going to depend on the speed that the House gets it through. And then, of course, whether the Senate can get a compromise. I know that Senator Manchin, Senator Tuberville, and others are working on a compromise. And so I'm not absolutely certain they can't get this done this year. But clearly the Senate will be the complicating area to do so. But anyway, that's a little overview. What is also propelling this is the fact that certain states now are moving forward on legislation, like Oklahoma most recently, where their legislatures have passed a bill that would basically take any enforcement away from the NCAA on NIL issues. So here you're going to have a number of states passing bills where the NCAA they're inoculated against any NCAA action. So if there's any reason it calls for national legislation, it's those kind of state bills which basically gut the NCAA from enforcing anything. And so I think those kinds of bills are adding fuel to the fire of getting something done. And anyway, that's a little bit of an overview. Thanks.
All right. Since he was talking about the state laws, let's go to Gabe Feldman next.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good to see many of you faces and names. And I'll just add a couple things to what Tom mentioned in terms of the federal legislative effort and then a little bit about what we're seeing with the states, and then maybe just some quick comments on the overall NIL landscape. On the federal legislation, as Tom alluded to, part of the holdup has been the scope of any legislation. And the general sentiment is that Republicans want a very narrow, in some senses, a narrow bill that is primarily about name, image, and likeness, but that would also provide legal protection to the NCAA, whether that's under antitrust law, labor and employment law, preemption of state law, or maybe all three of those. Whereas the Democrats in general are looking for broader protections like the College Athlete Bill of Rights we've seen, or from Senator Murphy, the ability for college athletes to form unions and enter into collective bargaining. And so we've kind of had on one side, they're looking for narrow NIL legislation. On the other side, it's no, if we're going to legislate in this area, we want to make sure we're providing protection across the board for college athletes, not just on NIL, which in some cases may be taking money away from them that they're currently earning. But if we're going to do that, at least in the name of making these legitimate NIL deals, then we need to provide better health and safety, education, protection for the athletes. And then I think a confounding factor that has been introduced, it's been here for a while, but may drive the wedge even further apart, is to the extent that primarily the Republicans want to include language about transgender athlete participation as part of any college sports legislation. And there are room for compromise on a lot of the issues we've talked about. Transgender athlete participation is one where we probably have the opposite effect. That might push the parties further away. Some things I've heard is that maybe that's such a wedge that they're able to say, let's just do what we can do now quickly, where we all generally agree, which is NIL, and then focus on the other things later. So I do think, as Tom said, maybe it gets through the House if it's narrow on NIL, but when it gets to the Senate, we've seen plenty of Democratic senators who don't want this to just be about NIL. And whether it's a full Bill of Rights, or it's a hybrid unionization model or something in between. So there's still a lot of steps to go before we get anything. But as Tom has seen, and I've seen, and I think others on this call in this room have seen, there is definitely an appetite on both sides to do something on NIL. And I think that appetite is there for at least two reasons. One, because when the states did pass these laws originally a couple of years ago, and when there was a big push to open up NIL compensation to college athletes, the primary driver, there are other drivers, but the primary driver was to ask why we're treating college athletes differently than non-athletes on campus. And there may be a recognition that for certain things, they do need to be treated differently. But sort of the general approach has been, let's treat college athletes like everybody else, unless there's some compelling reason to treat them differently. And the question was, were NIL restrictions a compelling reason? And I think with the explosion of social media, the explosion of opportunities for students across campus, whether you're athletes or not, people at high school level, all levels, to monetize the value they've created in their image, in their singing, their comedy, whatever it might be, that why were we depriving athletes of this right? And then what we've seen is, yes, a lot of athletes have been able to get those deals and have been able to monetize their NIL in the sort of traditional way that we see pro athletes and celebrities do it. But then we've seen this other aspect of it where it has morphed into, particularly in bigger schools and bigger conferences, an opportunity for donors and collectives to find a way to pay money to athletes to either recruit them to come to the school or stay at the school. And it's in a lot of ways the very thing that the NCAA said they didn't want to happen, is that this just becomes a substitute for pay for play. Now, there are plenty of people who think that's great, but those are primarily the people who always thought athletes should be paid to play. So I think you need to separate those two things out and say, let's just say we want this to be NIL, and then we can do the pay for play debate separately. If you just want this to be about NIL, is it accomplishing what it set out to accomplish? And for many students, yes, it has, but clearly for a lot, it's gone way beyond that. And then the last piece that Tom mentioned is the idea for uniformity and why national law might be needed. And again, there's pushback from people who say, well, there's no uniformity in lots of areas. There's no uniformity on what coaches can get paid and spending on facilities. And I agree, there should be lots of reform in lots of areas. And we should try to rein in spending on athletics and shift that towards academics. But in terms of what is happening with college athletes right now, again, just focusing on that piece, the argument has been, well, yes, there are many different state laws, but in practice, they're not that different. And that may or may not be true, but the bigger threat is what we're seeing, and Tom mentioned, is there's nothing stopping a state tomorrow introducing legislation that would allow pay for play or allow revenue sharing or allow things that are clearly in violation of the NCAA's rules. Now, there's plenty of people who say that's fine. The athletes should be getting that anyway. But if we do want to have a uniform standard, then it has to come from the national level, from the federal level, because clearly the states are not going to do it on their own. Instead, the states have shown time and again that they are willing and eager to compete with each other to provide more athletes for their rights, whether or not that's consistent with what the federal rules are or supposed to be on the NCAA level. So I do think the NIL regime shifting into something that wasn't necessarily initially intended, maybe it was foreseeable, and then also the states continuing to use legislation to compete that makes it almost impossible for the NCAA to have uniform rules. I think that is probably convincing those on the Hill to try to find a way to reach a compromise to get federal legislation.
Okay, next we'll go to Donna Lopiano. Opening
Yeah,
remarks.
I have no disagreement with anything that Tom and Gabe have said. 2 cents. However, there was a Yo Woman's effort in the last session on the part of Cantwell and the Commerce Committee to make a deal, between the Republicans and the Democrats, and they came pretty close, but it fell apart. And I think they've given up for the current year. And Tom, you may disagree with me on that, but right now the Tuberville Mansion effort is all over the place, right? It includes an exemption, it includes whatever. I'm not sure that there's any brilliance on the Republican side to put together the kind of package that needs to be the compromise, right? That being said, let me take a different tactic. The system is frozen. The NCAA is refusing to enforce its rules on outside employment. Many people don't realize that the NCAA outside employment rules are very good now that they have taken the prohibition away that says you can't hold a job that has to do with your athletic notoriety, right? They've taken away that NIL piece. They've taken away those things that made it, really bad in terms of athletes not being able to be treated like other students. But if you look at the pieces of the NCAA outside employment rule, it's that one, your pay had to be based on services actually performed. 2, that the rate for that service had to be commensurate with local rates. There was an element of fair market value, and it not be pay for play, and it not be an inducement to attend. Those are all, really reasonable guardrails for outside employment. The NCAA is not enforcing that right now because it is deathly afraid of NIL lawsuits, right? If it tries to apply that to an NIL deal in which one of those elements, i.e. a service has actually been rendered, is there, then the whole, it just won't move. Let me suggest to you that in not enforcing its rules, that the NCAA is violating Title IX. I am not an attorney, but the institutions cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. When they form a governance organization like the NCAA can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So we know at the highest level, the NCAA cannot promulgate rules that discriminate on the basis of sex. So the question is there unwillingness to enforce a rule that would prohibit discrimination based on sex? Is that tantamount to advancing a rule that does discriminate on the basis of sex? And that's a little esoteric, but let me see if I can continue the point. Title IX requires all member institutions to provide equal treatment in terms of publicity, promotion, financial aid, recruiting. Look at what the NIL collectives are doing. They are recruiting. They are promoting. They are publicizing. They are doing all of these things that the institution is doing And they are doing it on behalf of the institution. And what OCR should be saying right now, and OCR should be doing, is enforcing existing guidance, nothing new, and just saying to institutions, guess what, you guys, you can't give significant assistance to an outside organization that discriminates on the basis of sex if they are just promoting football and basketball, NILs, for instance, or in actuality may say, oh, we do all sports, but there's no evidence that there isn't equal treatment, proportional treatment of male and female athletes. They are openly saying, we are doing this just for my school, just to recruit. And we have coaches who are literally telling NILs, this is what I need. I want you to know what the roster value of these athletes are to me. Not the fair market value, not rates commensurate with local rates. I want you to know what the value of that athlete is to me. And now add in the word inducement, add in the word significant direction on the part of the institution. There are institutions who are designating collectives as the official University of Texas collective. We know from all of our single-sex scholarship regulations that the designation of official is enough to meet the significance standard, for instance. There are schools that are openly saying, I need every one of my members of the offensive line to stay with me. And the collective says, oh, we'll give each one of them 50 grand, right? No relationship to fair market value. So what we have is an illusion that is occurring in the marketplace. The collectives are making people believe that they are something legitimate, but they were put together for one reason, and that is to induce or to create a situation where the attendance of current athletes would be retained. Last point, I think it disturbs me greatly that ADs are, and I'm saying this for Tom, so he can bring it back to his ADs, right? It disturbs me greatly that athletic directors have never, ever responded to the athlete classification of being an employee as advanced by Jennifer Abruzzo and the National Labor Relations Board Council. We can remove most of the definitions of employee with NCAA rules. You've all heard of the 20-hour rule, right? There's no 20-hour rule in the NCAA, but where did that come from? Where did the 20-hour rule come from? It came from graduate students. How do we limit our graduate student work-study programs, right? Right? So they have time for classes. So the NCAA takes that moniker, knows full well that kids are spending 30 to 50 hours a week on athletics, knows full well that the level of control would entice any an agency like the National Labor Relations Board to classify that kid as an athlete. So we have the NCAA refusing to act to legitimately limit student athlete involvement in athletic activities to 20 hours. It would be impossible to do that if conferences were national in scope, almost impossible. And yet now we've seen all the conferences, or most of the conferences, open up to the largest possible footprint, to deliver the largest possible television audience, to deliver the biggest media rights fees that we possibly can. The second thing that ADs have not done, and this means across the board, athletic scholarships should be 4-year grants that that would not allow, that are constructed in such a way that it would not allow the coach to fire the athlete. And right now, most grants are 1-year employment agreements. They're 1 year. And the coach at the end of that time, for no reason at all, not for cause, not for anything, can, get out of that commitment to an athlete. And so the ADs are sitting back, right, doing nothing, when they could at least do that and try to legitimize the academic relationship. They are not. The NCAA is not enforcing rules that would enable institutions to comply with Title IX, and the NCAA and the institutions themselves are looking the other way at collectives who are now acting on their behalf outside in terms of providing unequal treatment of male and female athletes. And that is the most frustrating situation I can ever describe. But I would invite, Gabe and Tom and all of you guys to, argue what the reality is right now.
Thank you. Next is Peter.
Everyone basically said everything that kind of needs to be said, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. Name, image, and likeness is 100 years too late. But I hate the phrase NIL. It connotates something that's different than what we're seeing. Name, image, and likeness is the ability to profit off of your marketability and publicity. But that's not what's happening in the space. And unfortunately, like most things, it's the adults in the room ruining it. And when I say that, I'm talking about agents. We talked about it earlier. There's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of regulation over agents, and they are taking advantage of athletes. The Jaden Rashada situation at the University of Florida. He had a 20-year-old agent that had no idea what he was doing and leaked all this information, and it was horrible. You want to, represent an athlete in the NFL, you got to take a test. You got to pay a fee, ongoing education, background. And if I'm a parent, a school, or an athlete, I can look you up and see what your credentials are. We do not have that, and we're talking about 18 and 22-year-old athletes, and that's very scary to me. Boosters. It's already been said what's going on with booster collectives. And as far as Title IX and what Donna said, where it got even worse is when these schools started doing outward promotion of their collectives and the athletic directors were saying, go give to these booster collectives. Title IX, therefore, comes into play even more. And it's clear that Title IX is not being adhered to as it pertains to name, image, and likeness. And then the states. The states are actually the reason we need a federal bill. The NCAA, as Donna said, has really straightforward good rules, right? Pay for play, inducement, no pay for play, no inducement, quid pro quo, a little bit of fair market value, which I'm sure we could discuss, the role of the booster with student athletes and the university, the role of the university and the difference between an enrolled athlete and a non-enrolled athlete. I'm going to push back a little bit on Gabe. He's absolutely right about why those state bills were created, but I worked very closely with Chip LaMarca, who pushed through the first state bill in the state of Florida. His reason for pushing through that bill was he was afraid the NCAA was going to go back on their word and not allow NIL. So he wanted to codify that. Well, after Alston, that was never going to happen. And now we have all these different states with different rules, and they're a facade. There hasn't been one state that has launched an investigation into improper NIL, whether it's with agents, whether it's with their boosters. And let's be honest, the state of Florida is not going to go after the University of Florida or Miami when we know Georgia and Alabama are doing certain things. Good luck getting reelected, right? But we don't have a single Division I conference where every member is from the same state. That makes this a federal issue. And now we have states like Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas creating safe harbors. So we do need a federal bill to protect what we're doing because of that. Although I'm also going to push back a little bit on Donna. I don't think the NCAA is necessarily deathly afraid to put forth enforcement. I think the lack of enforcement would actually hurt their causes in getting that federal bill. If you're punishing people, you're levying infractions, there is no longer the sense that this is the Wild West and you need help. If you're pushing through infractions and punishment, even if you're getting sued, it says, okay, you've got control over this. So in order to show that we have no control, that this is the Wild West, you need to show that there aren't penalties. From an antitrust standpoint, I don't think there's antitrust issues in going after charter member schools that are looking the other way and allowing NIL to be abused. So the space, it's still in its infancy, and I think we all have to remember that too. We're less than 2 years into something that has completely changed college athletics and sped up the discussion on transformation from employment versus amateurism. It's brought the boosters in more. This is going to take 4 to 5 years to figure out. So we are working together on this, and we're going to get there, but we live in a society where we want answers now. And that's a struggle. So overall for the athlete and in general, this was the greatest thing that could have happened. But let's get there because it's not playing out that way.
All right. Does anybody on the panel want to make any further comments from what other people have said at the moment?
Well,
yeah.
I'll add
Go ahead.
one thing just quickly.
One
And
moment.
yeah, I'll add one thing quickly. I do believe that it's really difficult to have the conversation of NIL and not talk about where college athletics is going. NIL and the transfer portal has sped all this up. And I bet you he didn't know I was going to do this, but I'm actually going to quote Gabe Feldman here. Every day the status quo seems to be more unsustainable. Some significant change is likely to happen in the near future. There is a consensus, though. Athletes should be given more. The question is, how do we do that while protecting the foundation of college sports? And that's what all of this comes down to. Change is coming. Revenue generating athletes are going to get a piece of the pie. But how do we protect all of our sports? How do we protect Title IX? How do we protect Division II, Division III? And do that where everybody wins? And I think there is a model out there. And I actually, the California bill, although I don't agree 100% with it, I think is starting to get towards what that is, which is revenue share without going the employment model.
Donna?
I would like to say I agree with Pete in terms of the NCAA is executing a political strategy in not enforcing NIL rules. But that is not an excuse for it to take advantage of the rules it can enforce. It is just dead in the water. Second point, the state of California bill that just I think passed out of committee the last couple of days, which is a pay-for-play bill in disguise. You have to look at the formula that is being imposed in terms of that bill to know that it's for football players and basketball players. And this is a repeat of California starting with NILs. Now California starting with pay-for-play. If one state goes, who else wants to pay their players? And in support of Pete's point that this is a state law issue. Everyone's involved in interstate commerce. There has to be federal control. Support that view completely.
Are there any questions from anybody that's on Zoom at this moment?
Do you want to add anything? She
I
called you out before.
what was the,
Donna, what did you call Tom out for before?
Oh, no, Tom was there when I criticized the ADs for not passing rules for 20 hours or 4-year scholarships or things that would make them less likely to be categorized as employees. I still think there's room for a congressional definition of college athlete as a special category of classification as an employee, a student and an employee. But if the ADs don't come just a little bit in creating a rule system that isn't total control of the athlete, I think the chances of that are slim to none.
I would only add some perspective here. You know, we've seen a evolution from a strong NCAA to becoming weaker and weaker. And in many respects, it's a very feudal system. You look at these conferences before, let's go back to when I played. Conferences were less than 10 people in their offices. They were scheduling entities. Now, because of the 84 Supreme Court decision and the loss of the NCAA's monopoly on television, the conferences have become these powerhouses, 100 employees. Their commissioners are like the lords of the castle. I'm not being critical. That's the evolution of the system. It's very feudal. And so when you try to get something done, I mean, just to give you one example, how hard it is to get a congressional bill passed because none of them are on. Well, they haven't been on the same sheet of music on this. But I think that's slowly changing. I think Governor Baker is bringing some collaboration together. But an individual AD in this system is like, I mean, they're caught up in the lords of the castle and the NCAA. And I think it's a question long-term for college sports. I mean, it would be like the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, saying, we're going to get out of the rulemaking business. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, you just make your own rules. And what we now have is competitors making their own rules. The NCAA says, oh, you can do whatever insurance you want for the kids. You can have them come as many visits as you want. You decide. It's all deregulated. And so that's a tough situation to be an individual AD in that world and to be able to change it. I mean, we can't even agree about COVID 2 years ago. And now we're trying to agree on NIL or an employment standard. I mean, I'm not being critical of any conference or anything. I'm just talking about the system is very Darwinian. It is not what you would expect of a national enterprise. Let me just finally say this word. Donna said interstate commerce. Absolutely right. Can you imagine having a country without a Safe Water Act, a Clean Air Act? How about airlines being nationally regulated? How about railroads being nationally regulated? Telecommunications? The reason why you have national bills is because you have national enterprises that need harmonization and consistency. And so you can't have every state doing their own thing. Otherwise, it's going to be a race to the bottom, which is where we are right now. Now, welcome. I hope 10 of these states pass this bill because this will drive action in Washington. And anyway, I just wanted to give that perspective on all this. So.
Yeah, but isn't it, when you talk about some kind of transformation in terms of NCAA governance, it went in exactly the wrong direction when it gave the competitive divisions power. And now, as Tom says, that really means that the conferences are these feudal entities that are going to drive to the lowest possible bar because they want the greatest possible autonomy.
That's
and
right.
that's
Gabe knows that better than anybody. He knows why that's happened. Gabe, he's still here.
Yeah, he's up there.
But how do you stop that when it's clear that the way the money is going and how it funds that those conferences and certain sports are driving such a large piece of the revenue, which everyone else relies on. So they do have more of the bargaining power. So finding a way to get everyone to work together while also being realistic and understanding who holds certain power is how we get things done.
Well, remember Olson, and again, I'm going to defer to Gabe on this. When we have a meeting and we talk about NIL or we talk about anything that involves student athlete benefits, we have to do it under privilege. We cannot collude. So even the ability to have a discussion on these things. And so what we've seen happen is college sports has become very siloed. It's just increasingly siloed. And I have a long-term view on this because I'm the only member of Congress ever put an antitrust bill in for the NCAA. I actually think that the cycle could come back to where they're going to maybe see a need for a strong national organization. But unless they're protected in some form of antitrust, it's not going to happen. But that's not going to happen. That's only going to happen if there's a crisis. And Peter and I were talking about this. The smartest people in the gambling compliance world say there's 100% probability of a major gambling scandal in college sports in the next 3 years. 3 years. I mean, if you have when I talk about a major gambling scandal, I'm talking about what happened similar in Germany in soccer. 200 teams, maybe 100 teams, maybe 200 athletes. That blows up many campuses. I guarantee you that will get Congress's attention. And people are going to start to say, you know, maybe this railroad needs to be run in a different way. That's all. But I think that I would bet anybody here, that there will be a major scandal in college sports very soon.
I would also argue that one of the bigger issues the NCAA is fighting is not as much the court, but the media and the media perception, which I think influences the court. And I think we need to figure out, what do we want as a community? And I think what we want is, we want to preserve college sports. We want to preserve Olympic sports and Title IX. We want to make sure Division II and Division III are around, while also recognizing that the money has changed so significantly that revenue generating athletes on the Power 5 level, Division I level of football, basketball, and women's basketball deserve a piece of the pie. And how do we move that way, right? I'm one of the weird people in the country that think the congressional hearing was a positive. And the reason I think that is we all work in this industry, and the questions that the congressional men and women were asking were the ones I get from my family and my friends, which shows the lack of understanding of what's going on in college sports regarding it's really just Power 5 football and basketball, or what NIL really is. And so I think there has to be such an effort to educate on what college sports is, what it does for this country, and how we can preserve it while still making things equitable for everyone, including Power 5 football and basketball.
Well, you watch a congressional hearing, and a lot of people don't realize that a member of Congress has 1,000 issues. You might have 5 legislative people, and they are each working on 30 to 40 issues. I mean, there's so many issues for you to keep up on. To think that members of Congress really understand this, that extent, is really a kind of a pipe dream. 1 or 2 do. And usually legislation is driven by small groups of people who have high interest in stuff, whether it is in, child safety or transportation or whatever. There's always a core of experts. So to Peter, I think Peter's absolutely right. I thought the hearing was positive because it showed that there was an interest. I can take you to hearings where there's hardly anybody. That hearing had a good interest.
They don't bring flags and have capes and dress up for their favorite schools. They don't do that in every hearing.
No, and I think that your point is that was a very good sign, because to me that showed the temperature is rising on these issues, and that will lead to hopeful legislation.
So I just want to break in for a second because Andrew online has a question, and it's a good question because I hear you guys debating, and you guys know you're in this 100%, and he says, well, what should we as faculty be most worried about for our students and our institutions? And he's putting into words my sense of panic. You guys are talking and we're looking at federal legislation, and me just teaching, I don't know what's going on. And then, football might leave the NCAA, and it might, it's like, it's confusing. So what should faculty know? What can faculty do?
Suggestions, all right, and the power of the faculty lies in the Faculty Senate, and COIA was established with that kind of recognition. The problem is whether or not the Faculty Senate will stand up, right, on any athletics issues. It is more likely to do so if it is an issue that's academically related, that is central to the academic integrity of the institution. That's where the Senate's, the Senate's better than I do, right? That they would like to think themselves as the guardians of academic integrity. And there is much that can be done there. For instance, there shouldn't be academic support programs for athletes that are run by athletic departments when there's such a conflict of interest. Does it really make sense that the athletics advisory board of an institution, that the faculty representative is chosen by the president as the weakest sister in support of athletics? Why wouldn't the Faculty Senate insist on appointing the faculty representative? There are 2 or 3 things that would really, I think, change the system in terms of faculty involvement. But boy, what a political mess that is, breaking those control issues.
Yeah, I
That's
also
what-
think,
Sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's what major universities that have faculty senates are trying to do. We have input, into suggestions for the FARs, and we have faculty representation on the athletic council of the university. But some other schools we ran into when we're trying to get more members into COIA, they don't even have a faculty senate. So, we have to figure out how to help them in that area. Go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, I was just going to say as a bigger picture point on this, and goes back to what Donna was saying, that she's disturbed by what athletic directors have or haven't done and what schools have or haven't done to try to move the determination that athletes are employees back to the fact that they could be students, because there obviously hasn't been any binding or dispositive finding on that. And that the approach that one of the plaintiff's lawyers in the FLSA case, the Johnson case, said, which I thought was both simple and profound, when I asked him, what could colleges do so that the courts won't treat college athletes like employees? And his answer was, stop treating the college athletes like employees. And then the courts and the legislative bodies won't consider them to be employees. And it's pretty simple, but it's again, I think it's a powerful thing to think about how that's not being done. And I think that impacts almost every area of law that we're looking at, whether it's antitrust, labor and employment, all other areas where the reason college sports got different treatment than pro sports and other non-sports industries was this idea that college sports are special and different. And why were they special and different? Part of it was the amateurism argument that they were not paid. So we could say that's been carved out away a little bit because of NIL. But really, I think for most, the essential piece was that they are legitimate students who are getting genuine educational opportunities, and that sports is part of that educational opportunity. To where we are now, where the courts that are looking at this are saying that not only are sports not part of the educational opportunity, they're interfering with the educational opportunity. And can we, and this is where the faculty can be involved, and this is, there'll be a lot of pushback on this, but I've written a white paper on this. The Knight Commission has talked about this. Others have talked about this. Arian Waite down at UNC has written a lot about this. Why is it that we celebrate and respect music majors and art majors and theater majors and dance majors and say that that is a wonderful part of education, and we will give academic credit for all aspects of that participation? But then when we talk about, well, what's so different between playing an instrument and rehearsing and then performing versus playing a sport and practicing and then playing a game? Why do we treat those so differently? And there are some obvious answers right off the top that, yes, there are more scandals involving athletic departments than music departments. So there is the competitive aspect to it that leads to bad incentives, that leads to bad actors and leads to corruption. But if we put that aside, right, if we just control that and say, we know we need to avoid the corruption, we know we need to avoid the shadow classes, we need to avoid the things that would really be not part of the meaningful education. But that's already happening, right? We already know that that exists. So if we change to try to provide more academic value for what these athletes are doing, I don't know that's going to make that situation worse. So let's just put aside the corruption abuse issue and say, is there something fundamentally different about the academic value that one gets from becoming an expert in their sport versus the academic value one gets from becoming an expert in their music or in their art or their performance? And what is leading to the difference? It's not, I don't think it's just the competitive issues. I do think there's a racial aspect to it. I also think it's just the way that we've treated it. And this goes back to the point about what about faculty involvement and Donna's point about who's overseeing some of the academic components of athletics. If we have full faculty involvement, if faculty are teaching the courses involving the athletes, and it's not, the coach is going to be doing all this. If we make it just about what is already happening on campuses where the athletes are not taking academics seriously in lots of different areas, then this idea would make it worse. But if instead we say, hey, look at the music professors we have on campus. Nobody doubts their ability to deliver a meaningful education, but we require them to be full-time faculty. So let's see if we can do the equivalent for sports. We're already teaching sports analytics. We're teaching kinesiology. We're teaching sports management. We're teaching all of these things. But how can we do it? So, for example, a baseball player or a softball pitcher, when he or she finishes pitching 5 innings, they can look at all the analytics from that game and then have it be part of a paper they're working on, where they are studying analytics, studying how to be better in their sport, but it's not interfering with their academics. It's part of their academics, just like a violinist would do something similar when we get academic credit for. So that's the way I think we can actually try to move this back towards putting education as part of the primary focus, is not separate athletics from education, but make athletics part of education.
Yeah.
Gabe, this was
Can we
done.
pause for a second and ask if there are any current questions from people?
It's okay, let's.
Well,
Okay.
I wanted to follow up because we were having a discussion about that earlier in the room, which is the way we're educating athletes. And I think that that's really the big, takeaway from what Gabe was talking about. When you have classes, you're talking about usually, 20, 30, 50, 100 kids in a class, that's fine. But when we talk about what's happening with athletes and when they're educated on certain topics, we bring 300, 500 kids in a room, we bring in a guest speaker, and we are just checking boxes rather than promoting and actually moving forward the actual education. Because we were talking about financial literacy and things of that nature as well. And, you bringing in, and Gabe's point, how do we actually make education more from the educational side of the school rather than funnel it through athletics and have athletics running the academic side? It's a little backwards, especially when, let's be honest, the role of the athletics department and the athletic director is to win games, raise money, and take care of athletics. Bringing the academia side more into it would have a more profound impact. Although, I think that would benefit everyone.
I would like to say something about it, because right now, one of my roles at the university is Director of University Honors. And one of the biggest things that we're doing is bringing in NACE competencies, which are the career readiness skill sets, where a lot of industries say they need to be proficient in technology, communication, leadership, teamwork, diversity, critical thinking, career and self-development, and professionalism. When you look at athletics, all of those things are being taught. But the problem is, it's not a conversation of educating faculty sometimes how these skill sets are being taught. A lot of students are learning how to deal with diversity of thought, diversity of people from different backgrounds, using technology as analytics to analyze tape and things of that nature, teamwork, leadership, communication. And I think it just needs to be a more healthy conversation of how athletics does serve as some educational and developmental training that's being learned in that sport. And then it's been brought out, because I do think you bring up some great points about, when you look at music and all of these other fine arts, it's the same thing, I think, to a certain extent.
And we've got a comment online. I know Jake wants to ask a question. So, sorry, her name, Eva, says, I'd argue that athletes are often being coached by coaches who have their positions because of their athletic accolades, not because of coaching education, like professors of music, theater, etc. So anyway, just keep that in mind.
Well, I would agree with Gabe 100% on so many of these skills that you learn in athletics should be part of the curriculum of the school and shouldn't be taught by the coach. And we should be using the market to encourage kids to get a degree. Look, I'm going back on the board of the University of Maryland, and education has changed since the last time I was on the board. Nobody goes to school in 4 years. They all spread it out. They some of them are just want to learn the skills for their work. It's a totally different educational regimen. And I think sports needs to fit in that. But one thing I will say is, so even if we had that system, I still think, I was on a panel with General Counsel Bruza this week, and she made it clear that the big reason was control. The fact that coaches control kids. And that's the reason why they should be under that test. an employee. So I'm not so sure that if you had all these curricula additions and add-ons, which is to Gabe's point, whether that would ever deal with the issue, the core issue of employment, which is the fact that the coach exerts so much control over the athlete. And I don't know how you're going to change that. And certainly I would always defer to Gabe and his legal wisdom on that. But to me, that's the challenge. And she seemed to not care about any of the other arguments about, about what it would mean or consequences. She was putting a simple test here that they are under the control. They need to have a voice. They need to be, have all the labor protections that any other employee has. That's really where she came at it. And I'd be curious to ask Gabe, how would the curriculum adjustment change that control feature?
Yeah, so I think there's two points on that. One is, as Donna said, the control aspect, some of that could be just by limiting the number of hours that they're actually enforcing the limits on the number of hours they're spending on college athletics. Another one could be not requiring travel across the country to play in athletic competitions. But I think more broadly, it's when you're making a decision about athletic participation, at least make the educational component a factor in the decision, maybe not always the number one factor. But in terms of the curriculum part of it, I think a big reason why the Northwestern, the regional director back in 2015 came down the way he did, and why Jennifer Bruzzo is taking the approach she is taking, is the argument has always been that these are students and that the reality of the economic relationship between the school and the athlete is that they're students, and what they're doing is primarily for the student's benefit. And what we've seen now is the view as well, no, they're doing it primarily for the benefit of the school because they're generating so much revenue. And they're completely controlled by the school and everything they do. But if you are using that control to further their education, right? So you still may control them, just like there's complete control over a student, how many classes they have to take and how many lab hours and writing requirements and all that. Nobody looks at that and says, oh, look how much control you're exercising over them. That makes them employees. That's exactly what makes them a student and not an employee. So I think if some of that control is actually being used to further their education, rather than used to just generate revenue through the sport they are playing, you might get a different analysis from the board. And I think you might get a different analysis from Jennifer Bruzzo. Now, you may not, and Jennifer Bruzzo, again, her job is to encourage collective bargaining and is to encourage people to seek employee status. So she's an advocate here. So it may not be enough to change her mind, but it may be enough to change the minds of the courts and of the full board. So I do think if you made this more about academics, maybe you can't. Maybe that's a pipe dream, and maybe it can never happen at FBS football and men's and women's Division I basketball. But for the rest of college athletes, including the ones who are in the Johnson case right now, the Villanova football players and the Sacred Heart softball players, and the ones who are not generating millions and millions of dollars, I think, unless some changes made now, they're going to be employees. And there are ways to at least reduce the likelihood of that happening.
I actually have a question for Gabe and Donna on that though. Because we just started talking about employee and employment model. And I think a big question that people get is, if there was an employee designation or athletes were deemed employees, how will that impact Title IX and the ability to enforce Title IX?
I'm going to let Donna jump in because she's been trying to jump in, and it's also every time if it's Title IX, Donna gets present on Title IX.
I want to go back one in terms of performance curricula.
Bring it back.
For athletes. Just briefly, I tried to do this in the 1970s. And what was very clear is when the athletic department was talking about a performance-based athletics curriculum, they were not talking about kinesiology. They were not talking about exercise physiology. They were not talking about analytics. They were talking about a less challenging major. And the distrust of the faculty in that regard is palpable, right? There is no trust. And the power differential on campus is the president knows he can't control athletics, right? Thank God the faculty approved curriculum, right? So we're going to have to, get over that huge bar if we're ever going to get a performance curriculum. We know we can construct it. We know it's legitimate. We know everything that kid should have. But that's not what the coaches really want, right? In terms of the question on Title IX and employment, if you make them employees and you're giving them financial aid, you're giving them compensation. Scholarship is compensation. Cash is compensation. It's all compensation. You're going to have to do it equally between male and female athletes, or an equal proportion of male and female athletes, which is why I think we should move in the direction of, we should make sure that 50% of all revenues goes to the benefit of athletes, and we should make sure that 50% of all revenues goes to either the education of athletes or the medical care of athletes. And not outright salary, because you know what that is going to do. That is going to make evident professional sports at the college level. That installs professional sports at the college level. And the last I checked, it was against many state laws for a nonprofit educational institution, a state institution, to give any of its assets to anyone outside of the institution for private gain. And that's exactly what they're doing under the guise of NIL collectives. So I still think that the women, for sure, are going to say, I don't care what you call it, salary, employment, whatever. Title IX is the existing statute that's there right now.
We have questions. Jake online?
No, Jake
actually-
right
Oh,
here.
there you are, right there.
And then Mark,
Take in the flesh.
and then Mark online.
Okay.
After Jake.
So I'm going to make a couple observations. I have a unique opportunity to be a certified athletic trainer, but also a researcher, and I interact with all of our collegiate athletes in a clinic, but also as a faculty member and a department of kinesiology. And I'm going to make two observations based on the comments that were made this morning, and we're referring to this idea of athletes really deserving the same compensation as employees. I would argue that athletes are more than employees, meaning that during the pandemic, nobody was allowed on campus, or as we say at UVA, on grounds until September of 2020, except our athletes, throwing healthcare to, or potentially throwing the best interest of the athlete to the wind. Some would argue that those athletes got the camaraderie, they got the teamwork that no one else received during that time, which is really great for their mental well-being. However, as a country, we're still figuring out how to manage the pandemic. So in essence, we're asking these young men and women that are moving away from home for the first time, who might be dealing with experiences with their own family and their own environment from wherever they're from, to do something no one else in the country was doing, or especially at the Division I level, at least at a Power 5 university. So as an observation, I question the idea of, are athletes employees, or are they something else? When employees were told to stay home, athletes had to attend to practice a game, which is an elective activity. The second thing is a faculty member observation I make, and I have this happen every year. I am continually discouraged and unimpressed with NCAA, where I have students that are students first, athletes second, going to the NCAA institution to pursue what they want to pursue. They're wanting to be in business. They want to be in kinesiology. They want to be a physicist. They want to be a performer. However, they can't take the courses they want to take, and they have to choose different majors. That is completely against the idea of a four-year institution. It's the idea that an athlete, I recall one, I'm going to try to be as anonymous as possible. One athlete, as we advise our students from kinesiology, sat in my office and said, well, this is really great and everything, but I won't be in your office tomorrow. Well, why not? Well, I'm in this sport and we practice during the time the courses are offered. So I was told I have to choose a different major. So we're going to be talking about mental health later. And the question I would have is, this conversation to me, and this is a really important conversation. So I'm going to say this, I'm going to regret saying it as soon as it comes out of my mouth. So I apologize. But I've thought about for this last 30 minutes. this conversation is myopic because we're talking about a 4-year period of a young athlete's life where they're doing something they may not be able or be passionate about to do upon graduation. So they're retiring from something, but they have no idea what to retire to. And I think that's unfortunate. And again, I bring that perspective saying that this is a 4-year commitment from an athlete to pursue a degree, which some of them, rightly so, may not have been able to pursue unless of their athletic abilities, but they still made it. And here's their opportunity to be that professional, but then they're told they can't be that professional because of a sport, which a very small percentage, I'm preaching to the choir here, will go on to participate in after the collegiate career. So those are more observations than not, but I do think that this really needs to come into context. If we're talking about employees, well, we've seen evidence over the last 2 years during the pandemic. And in fact, more recently at the University of Virginia with Lavelle, Deshaun, are 3 athletes that were brutally shot on a bus, and the amount they meant to not only to their team, but the entire community around the University of Virginia, and affected a lot of the students much more than the pandemic ever did emotionally. And so I would suggest that this conversation extend beyond this idea of employment, because the employees stayed home. They were told to stay home when athletes were told to report to practice. And then those individuals that will be one day employees can't pursue what they want to pursue for some, because it conflicts with their practice schedules. And I think that's unfortunate. It's a disservice to, I think the very reason why this group is called together, why we're here, is to serve not only the student athlete, but the future professional, the future parent, the future grandparent, and the generations that choice during that 4-year period has implications for years, decades down the road.
I would make 2 quick comments. One is, the government treats college athletes different. Their scholarship treatment. If you got a scholarship with room and board, you pay taxes on that. A college athlete, the IRS looks the other way. So they are already in this quasi category. To your point about not being able to major, I think my own life, when I was a chemistry major, that's a very tough program.
Yes.
Because the labs, and I would have to show up late for practice a lot of days. I wonder when that changed. In other words, I'd love to know how many big time athletes are chemistry majors anymore. Could you even be a chemistry major? Would you have to, because they don't have it in the summer, you would be able to do labs. And I really think that is a really big problem. I totally agree with you, because I can't imagine if I was coming to college and I wanted to be a chemistry major and I couldn't do it, it would be really difficult.
So I'm a first-gen student, and I was fortunate to be one of the first PhDs in my family, right? And now the cool thing is I get to interact with students that are also first-gen students and say, you can do this, except if you play the sport.
That's true.
And then so you are going to a student athlete that doesn't have the guidance that others had, who've had parents that went on to get even a 4-year degree or an associate's degree. They have no idea how to navigate this collegiate environment. And we're saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. And suddenly this conception of what college is and what it could be.
When did this change? When did this change? Does anybody know when this?
I don't know, but this is what's used in the argument on why these student athletes are employees, right? These restrictions, and the facade that, specifically when dealing with, Power 5 institutions, that they're not really amateurs or they're not really student athletes. They're athletes that also happen to be students. And so we have to resolve that. And otherwise, this is going to be a very difficult conversation and uphill battle for college sports to remain out of employment if that is what we want.
It wasn't a light switch.
Yeah, Tom.
Light switch. It gradually changed over the years, and it's more prevalent in the Power 5 than it is in smaller D1 schools. Donna, because we have more latitude.
No, I just think it's follow the money. As soon as you saw the revenue growth, you saw corruption. It was kind of, inevitable. But there are even larger problems in the corruption of academia. We are not handling special admission of athletes very well. There's an assumption that football and basketball players are dumb, or that they They don't belong in school. They're subject to discrimination because they're predominantly Black. Somebody thinks they took a spot, from a more academically adept student. Here's what we know about that college athlete. We know that they have average to above average IQ. We know that almost 40% of those special admits either have learning disabilities, ADHD, or reading, writing, and math deficiencies. We know that the schools are not addressing any of that in terms of a commitment to remedying that and giving them a legitimate education. We know that one of the primary indicators of graduation is taking in your freshman year a course, 24 hours of legitimate courses. And what do athletic departments do? They admitted an underprepared athlete. They put them in a course in which they will experience success. They tell them point blank, I don't think you can do this. You need an easier course. And they undermine the aspirations of these kids. And we've got to start tackling it there. The athletic departments are bereft of ethics in this regard.
Okay,
We do.
we had a question from Mark online.
Yeah, thank you all. Actually, because of the previous question, I want to add, I know of two athletes. So I was in college athletics from 98 until 07. And I know of two athletes that were told to switch their major because the class they needed was in the afternoon during practice. And there was only one class offered. But I've also seen the other side. I don't remember if I mentioned this last year, but from an administrative side, before I get to my question, I was in an institution where the coaches were told to bring in 20 to 30% more athletes than they were going to put on the roster, hold them until the 12th day, which was the reporting day, and then either cut them or redshirt them or whatever. And so, because it was a funding issue. So I've seen both sides of that issue, and it's disheartening. But my question is this. So I'm going to go back and report to my faculty, and they're going to want to hear, oh, everything's great, and there's more power in the student athlete. But I'm also questioning, and I'd like to hear from the panel. Obviously, the power has been granted over to the student athlete much more than it was. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on? How do we control it because of the rapid growth? I know a University of Florida recruit negotiated his NIL before he even got there. And so I'm wondering, what kind of problems do you predict might happen? And some things I've talked to other people about, do you see things like holdouts like you see in the pros? Or do you see things like, I want to negotiate that I'm not going to study hall, or I'm not going to class because I'm a 5-star recruit? Do you see things like declining enrollment at Division II, Division III because they want to take their chances on walking on? What kind of possible things do you see that as faculty could be concerned about? Or do you see any? Do you think it's just, overwhelmingly the NCAA does have control? And I'm just curious on your thoughts of things we need to watch for and maybe have a say in.
Yeah, we got an example yesterday, which is when you have decent agent involvement with a high-profile athlete. Rumors leaked yesterday that the quarterback at the University of Miami, Tyler Van Dyke, was unhappy at Miami and was threatening to transfer if he didn't get a better NIL deal. I actually don't think that's true. I think he has a savvy agent who has an athlete who has NFL potential, who's in the middle of a rebuild, who wanted the athlete to transfer, but didn't want to come out and say it's because my team is bad and my coaches are bad. So it's easy to then blame NIL, right? It saves everyone's emotions and feelings. Now he ended up coming out and saying he's going to stay because the window was too short. But I think as agents get involved, and when we deal specifically with Power 5 football and basketball, the professionalization of those sports is already happening. So getting agent involvement and trying to negotiate certain things to make their clients' lives better is already here if you know what you're looking for. And so I don't know if you'll see it on the study hall level and things of that nature. But with the transfer portal And with NIL, although what I just mentioned isn't real NIL, which goes back to what I said at the beginning, I hate the phrase NIL. It's already happening. So it's going to be interesting on how things start to play out that way. But again, we're still another 2-3 years away from really seeing how this is fully going to play out. No one's an expert in this space as it pertains to NIL. If so, we would have predicted collectives day one. People didn't see that coming. We knew there'd be booster involvement, but not collective. So it's going to be interesting. So the answer is yes, but not exactly sure how.
Hey, Mark, you're familiar, with the data that less than 4% of all college basketball and football players will ever see one day within the NFL or the NBA. I think you're right that the top, 2 to 4% of all athletes being recruited might be able to have enough guts, right, to negotiate a deal under the table or over the table. But the vast majority of athletes are 18-year-old kids, and they cede their power to a coach because they believe, one, I am going to get a chance to the NFL. My coach told me that I'd have a better chance. They believe it, and they see the coach as the keys to the kingdom, and they spend 40 years making the coach happy. Talk to most athletes who are in D1s, and that's the mentality. Not I'm so good I could dictate my deal.
We have a question from Vera.
Yes. I have a question for Peter first, and then for the panel. So you don't like the term NIL. What will you change it to if you had?
I think either calling it just fully name, image, and likeness, or you're right to financially gain off your marketability and publicity.
That's long.
Right, it's very long, but the problem is we just threw out this acronym and we're conflating what's actually happening. There is obviously a movement where revenue generating athletes deserve a piece of the pie, and a lot of us are unhappy that they're not getting that. So we are turning a blind eye and we are justifying what's actually happening in this space where boosters are getting involved and really it's now legal dropping bags, right? And it's being used to threaten to leave schools or be recruited. Donna said it best in the beginning. We actually have pretty good rules right now. They're just not being enforced. But when things are happening that we don't like and the role of the booster or what's happening in the quote unquote free market, we're justifying it as NIL because we don't like how the athletes have been taken advantage of. And that's what I don't like. I think they're two totally separate issues that have to be taken on totally separate. Tom alluded to it earlier, the narrowing of that NIL bill, and then we'll figure out the rest. That is step one. But until free market doesn't mean no rules. It doesn't mean zero regulation. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. And a lot of athletes are being taken advantage of. Many athletes are profiting and doing a great job in this space, but many are being taken advantage of, and no one wants to talk about that. And that's what bothers me. It scares me.
And the question for the panel, many of the athletes are first generation college students, and they are looking for a way to improve their family situation, their situation, etc. And I've heard the mention of having a major that would be more of an athletic major as opposed to a chemistry major or a kinesiology major. So my question is, what would be the content of this major that you are considering? And would it be a marketable major that would ensure employability and sustaining a lifestyle that would allow them to be, someone who gets a job that would be what they would want to have to sustain their lifestyle? So just an idea about the curriculum, what would be the content of the curriculum? Would it be academically appropriate eligibility in terms of marketability?
I don't have the answer to that. I know maybe Tom or Gabe does, or at least Gabe, I think you were the one that was talking about almost folding in some of the skills that these athletes learn on the analytics and stuff like that in the actual credit hours and courses. Unless I misheard.
Yeah, I don't know. That is the idea. And I'd say, let me start with one point before I get into some of those details, is that the current system in some cases does not do a very good job of educating our college athletes. in whatever major they're in. And as Donna said, it was a bigger issue maybe in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where they were creating courses as soft landing spots for athletes. And we don't allow that quite as much, but that doesn't mean that we're still not treating athletes differently and they're not getting the same educational opportunities. One of the infamous cases is Kevin Ross in Creighton, who was a pretty highly recruited basketball player, made it through 3 years at Creighton, had a D average, but was still eligible, and got hurt. And so the team didn't need him anymore. And they realized after 3 years of succeeding, but on the low end at Creighton, he had a 4th grade reading level. And he was not getting a meaningful education. They were not treating him like they were treating other students on campus. And he's not the only case. There are many of these cases. So I would say that many athletes, particularly at the FBS and men's and women's basketball level, are majoring in eligibility. That's why they're there. They're there to be able to stay on the court.
I'll give you an example. When I was in school, I was at Florida State. My second major was sport management, and I was a senior, and we had a very famous running back at the time. And he was an academic all ACC. And we did a peer review, and he spelled New York NU space YURKE. And we push these athletes along and give them these grades, and it's not helping them in the long run. So I had a real example of that.
Yeah, I mean, and there are many of those, and I think that start with the premise that the system's not working perfectly right now, to put it mildly. So if we had a perfect system, I'd say, yeah, we should be worried about what might happen if we start to put more of an academic focus on athletics. But I think the reason why it would help is for two different types of classes or reasons to do it. One is for people who want to work in the sports industry, and we could help them prepare for the thousands and thousands of jobs in the industry, just like sports management programs do. But we can do it in a way that is as academically rigorous as any other program on campus, which, as to Donna's point, was coaches didn't want that. Coaches wanted the classes that were easy, but if they made them just as hard as other classes, well, then what was the point? The point is, from the academic perspective, to give them a real academic opportunity to pursue something in sports. The other is that, or you say maybe those students don't want to pursue a career in the sports industry outside of playing. Sports is a really, really good vehicle for teaching other things. And as someone who's taught sports law for over 15 years, there's no better way for me to teach my students about antitrust law, about labor law, about contracts, about workers' comp than through the prism of sports, because people want to dive into it and are fascinated about it. And I could teach them a lot more about these areas of law because it is through the sports prism. So trying to get more underrepresented minorities interested in STEM, sports is a great vehicle for doing that. There are lots of areas where we could say they should be taking these sports classes, not because it's an easy landing spot and not because it's detracting from their education, but it is their education, and that they're learning a lot from it, whether it's they're learning something so that they can pursue a profession in that industry, or because it's sort of more of a liberal arts education, that we are teaching them valuable lessons that isn't necessarily career specific, but are important things for them to learn. So again, I think we go back to, we don't ask those questions about music and art and theater. And I think if we created the one, get over those barriers that Donna mentioned, just a lack of trust, and then 2, create and establish real full-time faculty to teach these classes and to study these areas, then we can get to a position where people treat sports as a serious field of academic study. And then I think a lot of these questions kind of get answered. But until we do that, I agree with Donna's point. It's no faculty is going to want to allow it.
Gabe, I'm sorry, Gabe, you know that there are majors in sport all over the place, from sport management to sport history to, you can do coaching at some schools. Those programs exist. And to say that performance major doesn't exist, maybe the curriculum isn't exactly right, but they exist now.
They exist, but they don't take advantage of the many hours that the athletes are spending playing. They don't extract the academic value from that. And that's what's different from the music and the art and the theater, where you're getting the academic value for the performance itself. and you're tying your
But-
education into that performance.
There's something more
even-
fundamental
even-
different though between.
Even the physical education major, doesn't get 3 credits for every hour they spend in their activity classes, right? The point is you would have to treat that athlete in the same way. Yes, you'd give them the hour of credit for every 3 or 4 hours of performance or whatever, but you're surely not going to do it on the basis of more than 20 hours, right? So behind this logical conversation of a performance curriculum is the reality of people who do not want that curriculum to be legitimate.
Yeah, no, I agree. But there are already people who don't want the existing curriculum to be legitimate. That they're
Exactly.
delegitimizing
Exactly.
what's here. So I don't
Yeah,
think
let
that
me
should be
go
a.
back to our
Exactly.
question.
But isn't it
Let me
true
go back
that-
to our question, because I think, oh, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered, I mean, until recently, isn't it true that college sports were seen as an avocation? Not the reason you go to the school. It's an extracurricular activity. And therefore, it's not subject to the same course restrictions that an actual course in music would be, for example. There's music theory and there's all that stuff. Nobody teaches, sports theory. Coaches don't do that. They don't give grades, and they don't proctor exams. So it's someone, as COIA is to supposedly exist to protect the integrity of our institutions. And I'm watching what's happening at my institution now, where we've got a new coach coming in, replacing a guy who didn't win many games, who's saying that he's got to have 24-hour control over the students. He wants an athletic dorm where they'll have control over 24 hours. And I just think, there's some confusion between, I grew up as a minor sports athlete, graduated in 1971. And it was in sports in those days, I'm sure Tom might relate to this. I mean, it was an avocation. It really was. You could take chemistry. You could take other courses. My daughter 25 years ago wanted to be a nurse, and she was recruited at a number of big schools. And then the students told her, "You can't be a nurse. You'll never be able to be a nurse." So this has been going on forever. But I think part of the we're caught between this feeling that needs to be an academic endeavor. So like football needs to be an academic endeavor, with the fundamental premise, at least unless this changed. I don't know if the NCAA's changed their mission statement, but the fundamental was that this was an avocation. College sports are an avocation. It was an extracurricular activity.
No, so I disagree. I think you're maybe conflating.
It's in their mission statement.
No, but I think you're conflating the idea that it's an avocation and not a job. So that avocation is in there for their motivation for playing, which supports the amateurism ideal. That makes it separate from professional sports. But the suggestion was always that from the Greek days, that athletics, sound mind and body, that athletics is part of education. And
That's justification for offering an extracurricular activity. That was justification for that in high school and college sports.
No,
it's an
because
adjunct to the other education that you get.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's true, because you can say the same thing about music and art, that those were extracurricular, but they also recognized that there was
So
part
I
of an
had to look up avocation. Yes, I looked it up, okay, because I was a little confused here, but it is a hobby or minor occupation. So I think this is the crux of the problem. Are you going to school to be an athlete? And everybody thinks they are, but only between 2 and 4% really are. So I'm writing down things that we can ask faculty to do to understand and to help our athletes. But I know Jerry has a question and Greg has a question, but this is a great discussion.
I don't per se have a question. I just want to keep everyone conscientious of the fact that, there's going to be a bell curve here in terms of the way, I don't want us to get into every student athlete or every institution does this all the time. There are lots and lots of institutions that are at every level, Division I down to JUCO, that are legitimately trying to do the best that they can for their student athletes. They offer additional educational seminars, additional training, additional edification in a myriad of ways. And so I just want to be very, very conscientious that we are keeping the greater good of these institutions, we get tailed off and a bunch of the haves, and we can tail down to a bunch of the have-nots, but generally,
This is what makes the conversation so difficult, because we always speak in such broad terms, but there's so many different classifications. I have an individual that works for me who was a quarterback at Division III Union. He will tell you, I knew what I went to school for. I was a student. I was afforded the ability to do that. And football helped me go further with that and get into Union. And I was a student athlete. But we get, and to me, this goes back to the issue that the NCAA is facing when I say they have not a court problem, but a media problem. Because everything we discuss is in terms of Power 5 sports or Division I, and it's very hard to have these discussions as everyone when there's so many different classifications and so many different ways to do things. And it becomes difficult to have these, hour and a half long panels without doing that.
And to add to Peter's point, there's 520,000 athletes. I said this the other day. There's about 20,000 of them that participate in real high revenue kind of endeavors, football, basketball, some women's basketball, some other sports. But you're talking about 4% of the pool of athletes. But our conversations in this room are all about that 4%. I could show you 500,000 kids who are really doing this fabulously. And so we have to begin to demarcate and say, okay, this is a really good system for those 500,000. It is the best, one of the best development machines in America. Matter of fact, if I were running the NCAA, I'd say, how do I get that 500,000 to 1 million from inner cities and so forth? I'd love to get that 500,000 to 1 million, because that is really the greatness of college sport. One of the greatest. And we have 20,000 where we have issues. And but again, we have to demarcate that to your point.
But the problem with that is, though, and I agree with all that, I brought it up, but we also have to be realistic about the fact that those 20,000 athletes are the drivers of a lot of the dollars that come in that allow the other 500,000 to play those sports. So we have to put more weight oftentimes on the decisions we make that impact that 4%, because it really impacts the other 96%. And that's where the difficulty lies.
They pay for it.
Yep.
Unfortunately.
Greg,
To address issue, I'm Greg Gardner. I'm at the University of Tulsa. I'm also a certified athletic trainer. There seem to be 3 of us in here today. So addressing the issue of sport as an avocation. So at our university, we have what's called a Pathways program, where we have students coming in from high school that are not athletes, that are, however, tied in some way, shape, form, or fashion with our athletic program. We're 2 years into the program, we have 138 of those kids on campus. Okay, they're never going to play it down. They're never going to shoot a free throw, but they're going into sport media, sport data management, sport history, sport sociology. One of the most popular classes on our campus is the economics of protest. And it talks about economically how an athlete is impacted, like Colin Kaepernick. What does that cost him? What does it take you to take a stand? What does it cost you? So I strongly contradict the issue that sport is merely an avocation. If you look at a professional team, I would say 10% of the employees are on the field. What about the other 90%? That's, I got to tell you, that model came to us from Tulane University with Rick Dixon. And Gabe, I think what you're telling us is kind of reflected in your philosophy. Sport is not an avocation. I'll take the money. I'll take the 138 people in the seats. Darn right.
Amy had a comment she wanted to make.
Actually, I'm sorry, a couple. I'm Amy from Duquesne. I really like that we've been making this parallel with the arts and theater and all of that, but I'd like to just make one point that I think everybody, and some of it have danced around. A large percentage of those students that major in the arts and theater are going to go out and make money in the arts and the theater. We know that it's a very small percentage of the athletes that are going to go out and become professionals.
But that doesn't mean, I have college athletes that come to work for me that we're great athletes, but they're going into college administration, to his point.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's $100 billion industry.
Oh, that was just a comment. I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying, let's be careful on how we present that. And I like the idea of this sport performance curriculum, but this is an area where I think sometimes people don't understand faculty and how faculty work and how campuses work. I'm not sure how easily it would be to create a curriculum that's going to cross the boundaries of a variety of schools and introduce such a, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I'm saying this is an obstacle that we will have to really think out of the box, which we should. And I like that idea as well. And I would like to just make a comment back to this feudal system. If I recall, NCAA was established by Teddy Roosevelt because the Ivy League schools were paying thugs to come. I don't want to say thugs, big guys. Sorry, I didn't say that. Strike that. They were paying people to come on and play for their school so they would win, right? And people were dying on the gridiron. So the end, and I appreciate and I understand. I agree, Donna. There's some really good stuff that the NCAA has created, but they're not enforcing it. And I feel like by this, and I'm not saying NIL is bad either, because I recognize that the student athlete's voice needs to be heard, and we do need to compensate them adequately. But if we gone back to the feudal, gone back to Teddy Roosevelt's day, over 100 years, have we kind of digressed now back to that state? And one final thing is our student athletes, there are many things that our student athletes get that our regular students do not get, which is reflected in the 62% general student body graduation rate versus the 90%. So even though we say they're not to be treated differently, they are. And a lot of that is advantages. So these are just all other confounders that are in the mix.
Okay, just we're out of time for questions, but I'd like to ask each panelists to make a closing comment. Tom?
I have to leave, but I really enjoyed this very much. Peter and I were just talking about this story that just came out. 3 NFL players are suspended for five. I thought it was 3, but for sports betting. So, you know, we talk about a lot of issues, employment, NIL. My own view is sports betting is the real fox in the henhouse here, and universities need to be careful. And that's sort of my admonition. But it's a pleasure to be with, as always, Peter, Gabe, and Donna. And thank you.
It's pretty perfect.
Yeah, I'll add that these conversations are necessary to get to where we want to be as a community, which is how can we protect what we love, which is college athletics, while making sure there's equity on all levels. And NIL and the transfer portal have sped up that conversation, and I think that's a good thing for everyone. It's going to get a little messy along the way. I don't know if there's a perfect system, but I think there is a system that everyone can be happy with, and we can protect athletes, keep college sports going, because it really is a good thing for everyone, specifically, you know, the 95% we talked about.
Donna? Closing comment?
Closing comment. I'd like to see us go back to national governance with an independent board of directors, that it does not have a built-in conflict of interest that leans toward winning, which is what the Board of Governors has become for the NCAA. We cannot put the power to control college sports in the hands of D1 or D2 or D3, or they are going to move in the direction of feudalism, as was described. And I think it's going to take a federal piece of legislation to get to that point.
Gabe?
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a fun conversation. And I'll just finish where I started, is if we want college sports to be treated differently because it is different than professional sports and because the focus is on education, then I think we have to make the focus on education. And that means when billions of dollars of new revenue come in, we need to spend a meaningful amount of that on education and not just on spending more money to spend more money on athletics. And we need to do it in a way that is gender equitable. We need to do it in a way that recognizes the value of broad-based athletic opportunities. And I think that can be done. It's going to require a significant shift, but I think that can be done. And I completely agree with Donna that a great way to do this would be to have an oversight entity that is majority independent directors. I think that's long overdue. That includes student athlete voice, and that the way we've done things for the last 80 years, it's not sustainable. And whether we want the courts to tell us what it's going to look like, or Congress to tell us what it looks like, or whether we want to try to figure out the solution amongst ourselves, I think we still have that opportunity. But every day that goes by, it becomes more and more likely that we're going to lose the ability to dictate the future of college sports. And I think that's really problematic.
I'd like to thank all of the panelists for a wonderful discussion. It was great.